And I'm delighted to be here today and to be part of the explorations of this really important topic. So many thanks to you and to IDEA for organising it, and also for putting together such an amazing panel of speakers. It's really fantastic to be here today with Dr. Audrey, Bryan, Dr. Ed Vickers and Joyce Raanhuis. So as you mentioned, this event is going to provide us all, I suppose, with an opportunity to look forward at future trends and the emerging issues in development education and global citizenship education, and to identify and explore possibilities and problems influencing how they are conceived and practiced. So I'd just like to say a huge welcome to everyone who's joining us today from the Dev Ed community in Ireland and from beyond. I'm working as the Programme Manager with Comhlámh, and Comhlámh is the Irish Association of Development Workers and Volunteers. So we have, I suppose, an evolving training and education programme that's underpinned by Dev Ed and GCE approaches. And I think in recent years, we've been working a lot with people who are interested in volunteering in the Global South. So we've really evolved how we approach this. So we're aiming, instead of that focus on the preparation and on being a good and ethical volunteer, to move people along in their thinking about fostering, like, I suppose, a deeper understanding of the complex realities of the world that we're living in, the interrelatedness of the crises that we're facing and the historical reasons for these. And we're increasingly interested in considering the cognitive, psychosocial and relational dimensions of the learning process. So we're very aware, I suppose, that GCE can take on many forms and it's understood and practiced differently in various learning settings. So we have a great interest in today's topic, which will really provide us with the space to consider and develop and deepen our practice and our thinking. So we're going to have two sections today, up to 2 o'clock. The first of which is going to be inputs from each of our panelists. And we're going to start with Audrey, and then I'll introduce Ed, and after him, Joyce is going to present. And I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Audrey Bryan. So Audrey is an Associate Professor of Sociology in the School of Human Development in Dublin City University. And her most recent work asks, what educationally and socially transformative possibilities exist when emotion, affect and feeling are taken seriously as a focus of educational research and practice. So delighted to introduce you, Audrey, and I'd like to just hand over to you now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dervla. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see the presentation. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today, and I'm grateful to you all for being here. Thanks so much to IDEA, the whole IDEA team, for the invitation to be part of the webinar series, and in particular to Elaine for all her incredible behind the scenes work that went into making an event like this possible today. I'm delighted to be sharing the stage with Ed Vickers and with Joyce. I'm very much looking forward to the other presentations. I think there's going to be some nice kind of threads of connectivity, and I'm really looking forward to the dialogue afterwards in particular. My presentation, as you can see, hopefully, is entitled Emerging Trends in Development Education, Problems and Possibilities. And the focus of the talk is this increasing emphasis on emotion, or what's variously referred to as emotional intelligence, or more commonly social and emotional learning within global citizenship education. I'd like to begin with a quote from the author Kazuo Ishiguro, who in a recent interview about his latest novel, Clara and the Sun, said, "We must always remember empathy can be harnessed to create violent hatred and prejudice as easily as to produce tolerance and understanding. Recent history has shown us this over and over." Ishiguro's reminder that empathy is not an unambiguous good, but can lead as readily to exploitation and suffering as to more positive outcomes, serves as a useful entry point into my thoughts about this new emotional paradigm that's sweeping global citizenship education. Evidence of this new emotional paradigm can be seen, for example, in UNESCO's hot off the presses Futures of Education report, in which the word empathy features 18 times. the word compassion 9 times, and the word emotion itself no less than 28 times. The prevalence of emotion within contemporary educational discourse is arguably quite remarkable, considering the fact that until recently, emotions were widely perceived as irrelevant or at least peripheral to educational policy making and discourse. Largely because education is widely perceived as being linked to things like rationality, knowledge acquisition, and cognition. The new emotional paradigm regards social and emotional learning and the inculcation of social and emotional skills, as they're referred to as within this discourse. So skills such as empathy, compassion, as well as a host of other proxy concepts, so such as well-being, resilience, kindness, happiness, optimism, or what Greta Thunberg might say, blah, 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 as essential to the achievement of the SDGs and as having a crucial role to play in global citizenship education more broadly. As Caroline Pedwell has argued, precisely because these effective qualities are widely perceived to be unambiguously good, the pedagogical focus tends to be on how we can cultivate them rather than a consideration of the risks associated with them. So what I hope to highlight are both the problems as well as possibilities that the increasing emphasis on emotion within education holds, and specifically within global citizenship. So I'm going to focus initially on some of the main difficulties that I have with the cultivation of these so-called skills or dispositions as a goal or an approach to global citizenship education, not least in terms of what's being sidelined or foreclosed by this particular affective turn. This critique then forms the basis of an alternative pedagogical framework that I'm just going to touch upon, I suppose, in the time that's available to me. And it's a framework that I have devised that doesn't eschew emotion, but rather privileges an alternative set of emotional responses that are associated with the process of becoming attuned to one's own complex entanglement in or proximity to various global injustices. But before I get to that, I just want to briefly outline the emergence of this global consensus about the importance of social and emotional learning, or SEL, or SEL for short, a discourse that was originally embraced by educationalists as well as global corporations because of its role in enhancing economic productivity and academic achievement, but which increasingly features as part of the lexicon of global citizenship. In other words, an instrumentalist discourse about the inculcation of specific skills, attributes, and character traits to promote academic success and workforce productivity has come to align itself with more justice-oriented adjectival educations, such as ESD and global citizenship, particularly in the service of the SDGs. SEL is increasingly viewed by organizations such as UNESCO and even the OECD as a productive means of enabling learners to engage affectively with global justices by such things like imagining and identifying with the suffering of others by putting themselves in their shoes, as it were, or of becoming more emotionally resilient in the face of complex global problems such as climate change. Similarly, problems as intractable as violence and hatred are believed to be remediated by redirecting, retraining, or rewiring the brain through mindfulness programs that focus on the biological roots of aggression and that cultivate compassion, empathy, and well-being. Informed by neuroscientific advances in brain imaging, this neurologically inflected view of emotion claims that skills such as empathy and compassion are not fixed traits. So in other words, something that you're either born with or not, but rather skills that can be fostered and strengthened through simple training methods based on mindfulness. SEL advocates believe that these complex affective capacities can be taught and acquired, just like one might learn how to play a musical instrument, for example. While mindfulness, compassion, empathy, resilience, and blah, 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 on the surface at least, seem like highly desirable traits, I think it behooves us to critically consider their increasing prominence within global citizenship education. So the primary question that I want us to consider in response to these developments is, what kind of global citizen is being imagined within global educational policy as a consequence of the foregrounding of SEL as central to the practice of global citizenship education. And one of the main difficulties that I have with SEL is that it has the ironic effect of diverting political energy away from the pursuit of global justice and redirecting us towards depoliticized, highly individualistic, and ultimately neoliberal versions or conceptions of the global citizen. The privileging of biological explanations for complex global problems such as violence and aggression or psychological distress, for example, forestalls political dialogue and undermines an appreciation of their material determinants. Relatedly, competencies such as emotional resilience, adaptability, bounce back ability, perseverance, and grit, all of these buzzwords that have kind of entered popular consciousness imply that people should be trained to adapt to social conditions, or indeed be blamed when they fail to do so, rather than equipped with a range of tools that they can use to alter the system so that they don't need to be so resilient or adaptable in the first place. So as Evans and Reid put it, the resilient subject is a subject which must permanently struggle to accommodate itself to the world, and not a subject which can conceive of changing the world, its structure and conditions of possibility. In other words, this version of global citizenship education legitimizes and prepares young people for business as usual ways of seeing and behaving in the world, rather than as change agents who can repair or transform it. Furthermore, as Megan Bowler points out, emotions such as empathy and compassion can play an illusory role in social justice and rarely result in sustained reflection or action on one's own complicit responsibility in historical and contemporary social conditions. If we're truly concerned with global transformation, I think we need far more complex forms of emotional engagement within education, which force us to ask difficult questions about our relationship to the injustices that we're teaching and learning about. So from my perspective, global citizenship education should not be primarily about cultivating skills such as empathy, but rather about enabling us to recognize the power relations within which we're embedded, to acknowledge the political consequences of our everyday actions, and to trouble and perplex us enough to make us feel sufficiently uncomfortable in order to open up questions about our response ability, that is, our ability to respond to the crises and problems that confront the world. So while I don't share the optimism that many feel towards SEL as an educational process that can eradicate global injustices, what the SEL movement might offer, given its increasing prominence within education, is greater recognition of the need to attend to the affective as well as epistemic or knowledge-based dimensions of learning. But in embracing the affective dimensions of teaching and learning, we need to engage with a much messier, far more troubling, uglier set of emotions that come into play when we're confronted with the difficult knowledge of development education. Emotions such as discomfort, shame, loss, guilt, and so on, which invites us to see ourselves as implicated in the inequalities and atrocities that are the subject matter of our field. Inspired by Michael Rothberg's figure of the implicated subject, a pedagogy of the implicated, as I call it, helps us to come to a deeper understanding of the material conditions that enable global injustices to persist and of our own role in enabling and benefiting from these injustices. I'm not sure if you can see it here on the slide, because I know there's a lot of material there, but this is just a representation, a visual representation of a framework that I've devised, a pedagogical framework called the Social Ecology of Responsibility. And for anyone who's interested, I can share the paper with you afterwards, which contains a more legible form of the image. The Social Ecology of Responsibility framework that's represented here in relation to the climate crisis, but can be applied to other development education topics or themes. It's one such attempt to enable learners to better apprehend their own complex entanglement in structural injustices. It places the individual or implicated subject, to use Michael Rothberg's terminology, at the center of a complex ecosystem, which helps learners to come to a deeper understanding of the symbiotic relationship that exists between individuals and larger entities, and encourages them to engage with global injustices from a position of non-innocence or self-implication. So in closing, I want to return, as I began, to the work of Ishiguro, who in 2017 won the Nobel Prize for Literature in recognition of his ability to produce novels of great emotional force or intensity. I believe that global citizenship education has a lot to learn from literature and the visual arts, and their capacity to raise profoundly ethical questions via emotional provocation, particularly emotions that help to bring into conscious awareness the complex dynamics and ecology of implication, from which meaningful solutions to the global challenges that we face begin to reveal themselves. When these messy, affective responses become the focus of individual and collective inquiry, they serve as the basis for productive questioning about what can be done in the face of profound injustices. I've been trying to demonstrate that creating a space to engage with conflictual and often disabling emotions that accompany living in a world characterized by asymmetries of injustice, suffering, and responsibility can be a highly productive pedagogical as well as ethical and political encounter. But when these difficult emotions are glossed over rather than worked through, or sidelined in favor of emotions that position others as objects of our pity or our empathy, important political and ethical questions are foreclosed, and our investments in particular ways of seeing or reading the world remain intact. That is, in the absence of deep engagement with emotionality in the global citizenship education space, we remain unshattered, untouched, and ultimately unable to see our proximity to the injustices that lie before us.
Thank you so much for that, Audrey. That was, I think, such an amazing presentation, and just in exactly 15 minutes, you touched on so much that is of massive interest to us in our work. And be really interested in getting a copy of your diagram, but I think just such a great exposition of the historical positioning of social and emotional learning within education, and how, I suppose, the dangers of that then in diverting political energy towards highly individual responses. These are all questions that we consider on a regular basis with our work, and the need for more complex forms of global citizenship education. And I suppose that very important dimension of considering the messy aspects, the things that make us uncomfortable in our thinking. And I love that idea of the pedagogy of the implicated. So placing the subject at the center of the social ecology of responsibility. And I think, there'll be a lot of questions and thoughts about that as well. So thank you so much for that, Audrey. It was great. And looking forward to getting back into it a bit more when the panel is fully completed. So I'd just like to now move on to introduce Dr. Ed Vickers. We're delighted to have him with us today. He's the Professor of Comparative Education at Kyushu University in Japan, and he also holds the UNESCO Chair on Education, Peace, Social Justice and Global Citizenship there. So he researches the history and politics of education in contemporary East Asia. He's the co-author of Education and Society in Post-Mao China and the co-editor of Remembering Asia's World War II. With Yoko Mochizuki and Krishna Kumar, he wrote the 2017 UNESCO report, Rethinking Schooling for the 21st Century, and he's also president of the Comparative Education Society of Asia. Thank you so much, Ed. I'll just pass over to you now.
Thank you very much, Dervla. And yeah, I'd like to start by also thanking Elaine and colleagues at IDEA for involving me in this very interesting webinar. Yeah, Audrey's presentation is fantastic, and I'll be hitting some of the same notes, but talking about the way some of those issues that Audrey was discussing are manifested in or have been manifested in the activities of a particular or UNESCO institute. Yes, the Mahatma Gandhi Institute in Delhi. It's a Category 1 institute, which, if you know anything about UNESCO, it means it's important in the UNESCO hierarchy. Established in 2012, and its remit for education for peace and sustainable development sort of aligns it closely with SDG 4.7, which I'm not going to bother reading out. The formal decision to establish this institute, which is Asia's only Category 1 UNESCO institute, was taken in 2009. And I'm going to look at its remit and how it's evolved in relation to three contexts, basically. First, very briefly, I'll discuss the sort of politics surrounding UNESCO as a whole. Then I'll say something about the Indian context, because this is an institute based in India and very largely funded by the Indian government. And then I'll look in a little bit more detail at how the Mahatma Gandhi Institute itself has sort of interpreted its remit for education for peace and sustainable development. And given that this is an institution named after Mahatma Gandhi, I want to pay particular attention to how it has interpreted that legacy, or how its activities relate or perhaps don't relate to Mahatma Gandhi's ideas, the ideas associated with him. So looking first of all at UNESCO, I mean, within the sort of environment or the complex of institutions involved in what's been described as global educational governance, UNESCO has been known for taking perhaps a more sort of idealistic approach to education, as compared with, for example, the OECD or the World Bank, which tend to be much more hard-nosed and much more focused on human capital. The OECD has promoted or pursued a sort of humanitarian vision, which has emphasized the intrinsic value of education, I suppose, rather than overwhelmingly focusing, as I think the OECD does, on education's sort of instrumental value. In other words, its sort of usefulness in fostering human capital or in promoting economic growth. But especially in the last 20 or 30 years, I think it's fair to say that UNESCO has found itself increasingly overshadowed in the sort of global education policy scape or global educational debate by the likes of the OECD, which have brought huge resources to the sort of quantitative assessment of educational outcomes, have received a lot of publicity, have received a lot of attention from media, from policymakers in many societies around the world. And perhaps, therefore, UNESCO has sort of found itself struggling for attention. UNESCO, I think, has also, therefore, in order to gain attention or to get itself taken more seriously by key stakeholders, adopted some of the depoliticized discourses to which Audrey was just alluding in her presentation. So on this slide, I've quoted Ewan Auld and Paul Morris describing the OECD's approach, despite its recent shift towards talking about global competencies, as still ahistorical and depoliticized. And as Audrey has already described, that sort of paradigm sees the promotion of global citizenship or peace through education very much as a sort of process of sort of technical adjustment and at the individual level through things like social and emotional learning, rather than a matter of structural reform or tackling vested interests that are related to unjust social, political, or economic dispensations. Okay, so I mean, very briefly, Gandhi. What would we associate with Gandhi? What might we expect an institution that sort of takes the Gandhi branding to be about? Gandhi, of course, is associated, as anyone who's watched the Richard Attenborough film will know, with peace, non-violence, non-violent protest. So very much with sort of active political engagement to redress various social, political injustices. At the same time, I should say that there is a tension within Gandhi's thought or political philosophy between an attention to sort of systems or structures which he only sort of vaguely engages with, and an attention to the individual. And there is an aspect to Gandhi's thought that, and we'll see this later on in quotations from Gandhi, that does focus on sort of transformation of individual consciousness as a route to transforming society. And he has been criticized for, in this way, effectively allowing elites in India to sort of maintain their privileges, or not confronting these structures of privilege in India in particular that underpin a sort of very unequal and unjust socioeconomic order. So while on the one hand, Gandhi saw social injustice as a huge problem, he wasn't advocating violent revolution, obviously. He wasn't advocating forcible reform of the social, economic, or indeed political structures in India. He wanted this to be accomplished peacefully and through and with the willing cooperation of elites. And so there are therefore elements in his writing and thinking that can be cited in order to justify a political philosophy that is rather unthreatening to vested interests. Now, at the same time, this Mahatma Gandhi Institute has been established in an India which, since 2014, has been ruled by the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party, which has a very, to say the least, ambivalent relationship with Gandhi's legacy and ideas. Mahatma Gandhi Institute, as I said, was established at a kind of tricky time in Indian politics, and arguably, especially for an institution that's associating itself with Gandhi, because it was the decision to establish it was taken under the Congress administration, which of course very much associates itself with Gandhi's legacy, with the independence movement that Gandhi led. But it actually got going really under the, or after 2014, when the BJP was in power. And I think this has, had well, clearly this has influenced the climate in which the Institute has had to operate. And I'm going to briefly talk through the sort of discourse that we see in the flagship publication of the Institute, which is a magazine called Blue Dot. Starting here with the first, some excerpts from the first issue that was published in early 2015. And then I'll look briefly at some later issues. So in the first issue, we do actually see, I think, a serious effort to address what elements of Gandhi's legacy might mean for the mission of this kind of institute. So there's discussion of non-violent opposition to an evil system, invoking the example of Gandhi's non-violent movements of resistance, satyagraha. There's a survey of global youth attitudes to global citizenship and the various crises of the world. There's an essay competition, which was conducted the previous year, which was won by an Indian student who talks very much about some of the tensions, injustices within Indian society. And it's interesting that this essay competition was won by an essay of this kind addressing the Indian context, because what we see in subsequent issues of this magazine and in the subsequent work of the Mahatma Gandhi Institute really is a lack of engagement with the Indian context as a whole. And that there are sort of indications of the direction in which the Institute subsequently moved in a statement that was published in the first issue of this magazine by the UNESCO Director General. So this leads us back to what I was just talking about the UNESCO context. And she is hailing the commitment of the new director of the Institute, just installed in 2014, his commitment to focus on developing digital computer games on peace and sustainable development. She quotes Gandhi as saying, as human beings, our greatness lies not so much in being able to remake the world as in being able to remake ourselves. So this reflects precisely what Audrey was just talking about, a sort of focus away from direct critique of political, economic, social institutions, focusing on the individual, focusing on ourselves. So in subsequent issues of the magazine, and indeed in the subsequent work that the Institute has done, there's been a huge focus on technology, video games. There's a quotation here on this slide about preventing violent extremism and promoting compassionate thinking through firing Gandhi neurons. So how do we promote peace? How do we promote attitudes consistent with global citizenship? Through sort of getting inside people's brains and triggering neurons. And we can see this focus sort of reflected in some of the covers of this magazine. And this is my favorite. How do we, so we insert this chip into a child's brain and he becomes critical, mindful, empathetic, and compassionate. Almost every issue of this magazine has an image of a brain on the cover. Yeah, so this is one of the later issues, and I'll just highlight a few of the references specifically to Gandhi. So there's an article entitled Peace Machine as a Re-emerging Gandhi, which is primarily about AI and very little about Gandhi. So it's not quite clear what Gandhi is doing there. There's an article in the subsequent issue of the magazine all about an Indian mindfulness guru called Sadhguru, founder of the Isha Foundation, who says my entire life's work is about individual transformation, because without that, there is no such thing as changing the world. The world, society, and the nation are all just words. The reality is just you and me and how we are within ourselves right now. So yes, inner engineering is the solution to the world's problems, according to this chap. Now, I'm going to skip discussion of this Rethinking Schooling report, which, as Dervla mentioned, I co-authored with Yoko Mochizuki several years ago. And just briefly mention a subsequent project that I'm now involved in with the Mahatma Gandhi Institute, which is called the International Science and Evidence-Based Educational Assessment.
I'm so sorry to cut in here, just to mention probably about 2 minutes left, if that's okay with you. Sorry for interrupting.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So, yeah. So this project is actually ongoing at the moment. So its final report is not out, but the position paper sketching out the agenda states, you know, our purpose is to, so obviously science is framing this, and neuroscience. Within science, neuroscience has a key role. We are taking into account what works, what does not, and where more research is needed. And here, the paper seems somewhat, arguably, to predict the conclusions of the report, because it says pedagogy has evolved with many new methods, such as gaming, learning through social interaction and play, contemplative practices that enhance sensual, emotional, and mental awareness. And there's a lot to learn about how learning happens at the brain and behavioral levels. So this again reflects very much the sort of thing that Audrey was talking about. So what do we see in the way that the Mahatma Gandhi Institute has evolved? You know, to what extent or in what ways does it reflect the ideas that we might associate with Gandhi? Well, as you've seen, there's been this shift towards neuroscience. So at the very early stage, there was an indication that the Institute was adopting a sort of broader remit, including a greater focus on curriculum, but also a more explicit focus on, you know, actual political, social injustices out there in the world and in India as well. And that it seemed to sort of disappear from at least the sort of most public statements of MGIEP's mission and purpose, to be replaced by this emphasis on neuroscience, social and emotional learning, and digital technology. And what this enables the Institute to do is to position itself at the sort of technological and scientific cutting edge of educational debate. And this goes down very well, not just within UNESCO, as we saw from the quotation from Audrey Azoulay, the former Director General, but also in India, where the government is branding India as this white hot sort of crucible of technological innovation. It's also, of course, and as Audrey's already pointed out, this kind of approach is fundamentally unthreatening to political, economic, vested interests. And in a society like India, riven by caste, huge socioeconomic inequalities, the message that the solution to all our problems lies in the readjustment of the individual rather than the reform of society is very congenial. So Gandhi, as it says on this slide, has basically been transformed or reinterpreted from a critic of power and of political and social structures, which he did criticize, however ineffectually, into a mindfulness guru. And finally, to sort of illustrate this transformation, 2018, 2019 was the 150th anniversary, it says of Gandhi's death, that should be of his birth. And this was celebrated by the Mahatma Gandhi Institute with a lecture at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, featuring Gandhi as a hologram in discussion with the Mahatma Gandhi Institute director and a French neuroscientist. So my question is, what would Gandhi make of all this? Answers on a postcard or in the chat box, please.
Thank you so much for that, Ed. Yeah, I think such a really apposite response and to Audrey's presentation, and very fitting in terms of the themes that she was discussing. So that idea of examining how Gandhi's legacy has been transformed through the particularities of the framing and the lens around education, and the concept of inner engineering, and how, I suppose, the shift to neuroscience then, and the depoliticization that goes along with this, and how I suppose maybe that unthreatening positioning of the readjustment of the individual rather than engaging in changing society has really become mainstreamed. So very well put, as changing Gandhi from the critic of power to the mindfulness guru. It encapsulates so much of what is going on, I suppose, in terms of the broader trends we're seeing. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think there's questions and comments coming in now that we'll get to after our final panelists. So I'm delighted now to introduce Joyce Raanhuis, who is a doctoral student at the Centre for International Teacher Education in Peninsula University of Technology, which is in Cape Town. And she has a background in migration studies from the University of Sussex in the UK. And her doctoral research focuses on the role of teacher professional development programs for social cohesion in the field of education in post-apartheid South Africa. And her research interests also include post-conflict education, social justice and migration. And we're delighted you could join us today, Joyce. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Dervla. Also, thanks to Elaine from IDEA to have me here, and Ed and Audrey as well. Really interesting presentations. So today I will be speaking about the experiences within South Africa and the role of teachers and professional development. And so I'll be speaking about one particular case study by drawing on the latest article that I wrote in Policy and Practice, as well as my PhD research. Yeah, so I'll focus on post-apartheid South Africa, or education in post-apartheid South Africa. But South Africa has been significantly influenced by the historical context of colonialism and apartheid. And yeah, schooling during apartheid was segregated based on racial classifications. So you had school, for example, they were situated in white neighborhoods for white teachers and white learners, and the curriculum that was favored by paternalistic and Christian values. So this curriculum was the same for learners that were classified as Indian, colored, and Black in these particular schools. But the quality of schooling was significantly lower in the schools in Indian, colored, and Black neighborhoods. And this includes the way how teachers were trained as well, because there was a lot more funding available for education for white learners, white teachers, teacher training as well. But when apartheid ended, the new democratically elected government had put in various policies and initiatives to upskill and reskill the teachers. And in a way to redress the inequality of the past, these policies also focused on the need for social cohesion and nation building very specifically. So what is, or why is it, why specifically South Africa? It's not a homogeneous country. There's 11 official languages, different cultures, and it's all in one country. So it's also a country with high levels of violence, and it's one of the most unequal countries in the world, partly due to the legacy of apartheid. So therefore, the issues of race and class and gender, they still play a very significant role in South Africa and in education in South Africa specifically. So when in other contexts you would, for example, want to learn about other people's cultures and languages, in this context, it's all in the same country. So by having said that, it's still a divided country, so whereby many people live in segregated neighborhoods. And the quality of education is at the moment still better in the historically affluent, in this case, the white neighborhoods compared to other neighborhoods. And teachers' lived experiences also are very different, and depending on their personal and professional experiences, so their lived experiences. And therefore, professional development makes it really important, is really important to support them on this journey. So when I look at social cohesion, this is the official definition of social cohesion in South Africa, and they focus on so it focuses on social integration, inclusion of communities and society at large, also about solidarity, and also about individuals and communities. So it's not only between the individual and the state, but also about individuals and different groups of different backgrounds, for example. So that's in this definition that includes the inequalities and inclusion and disparities based on ethnicity, race, class, nationality, age, disabilities, and different factors that endanger the division, distrust, as well. And also on active participation, working together towards the common goal, shared goals, and living conditions for other people. So although my focus is not explicitly on development education or global citizenship, as you can see, there are a lot of overlapping elements with social cohesion, what's used in South Africa as means to redress the inequality. So when I look at development education and continuing professional development, CPD, I see it as something that is equity oriented. It recognizes all forms of knowledge, such as indigenous knowledges that are individual, cultural, and also global. I see it as a lifelong process of learning and unlearning, such as one's implicit bias and prejudice, also the values and beliefs, and then specifically whose beliefs and whose values do you foreground, as the beliefs are influenced by personal, social, and cultural aspects. So all these changes, they require cycles of reflection and critical thinking. So CPD needs to be ongoing, and the spaces in schools need to be conducive to be able to critically reflect and think. CPD also needs to be equipped with teachers' skills, knowledge, and attitudes to promote positive change, which I will be explaining in the next slide. So when I look at contributing the knowledge and understanding, I view that as cultural understanding about environment, economic, political, and social relations, but also enhancing skills and competencies. That is pedagogical enactments very specifically, but also exploring the different perspectives of other people. Then the motivation to promote positive change, because it all leads to actually the doing part, the contribution to change. So this particular program, the aims of the program were to provide teachers with a better understanding to manage and embrace challenges regarding diversity, transformation, and social justice. And the program also provides strategies to understand and create an awareness of individual differences, developing cultural intelligence, overcoming unconscious bias, and strategies to create safe spaces. So this program was facilitated over one weekend, and this was part of a program from a teacher union. And the way how it was emerged was because there were protests in South Africa. That was in 2016 about the hair. So that was related to the policies of these schools, and these schools were particular historically white affluent schools, either public or independent schools. So it started with one school, and then in other schools there were protests as well, all linked to it. So it highlighted the need that actually something needed to change, not only the individual, but also the structure that the individuals are working in or schooled in. So the way how I speak about it is through these themes: the contribution to knowledge and understanding, strengthening values and attitudes for global change, enhancing skills and competencies, and lastly, motivations to promote positive change. So this first quote comes from a Isiprosa teacher and the second one from an English teacher. And they both highlight the role of the facilitator. So while we think of knowledge and the different forms of knowledge, it's actually really important to also pay attention to the role of the facilitators, but it also includes the role of the program developers. Because the positionality of the knowledge giver influences how knowledge gets produced, circulated, and consumed. So knowledge is partial, subjective, and situated. And in this particular case, the program was facilitated by two principals of historically affluent schools. So the teachers questioned the facilitators' lived experiences. So that's also important when we think of developing courses for teachers or for teacher training or workshops in a non-formal education sector. The second point is strengthening values and attitudes for global change. And when focusing on the values and attitudes, I found that it's actually very important that CPD programs focus on the reflexivity of the teachers, such as through journaling or exercises that allow for reflection. Because teachers became aware of themselves and the multiple voices and realities of others. And the awareness and the self-reflection and self-reflexivity can lead to increased critical consciousness, which is important for taking action. And in post-conflict countries such as South Africa, with the deep-rooted historical violence, inequalities, and injustice, the critical awareness includes recognizing and becoming in terms with teachers' inherited attitudes and values caused by the trauma of the past. But in other countries or other contexts, that would mean just to be more explicitly focusing on the implicit bias and the prejudice of teachers. Then enhancing skills and competencies. The CPD programs need to provide teachers with adequate pedagogies to implement in the classrooms. So this needs to be practical, so teachers can implement this more easily and in the South African school context, but also in other contexts which are vastly different. It's therefore important that these are context specific and for example, if you have big class sizes, then you can't use the same pedagogies that could work in smaller class sizes, or schools that are under-resourced or low-resource schools. They might not have all the equipment for IT, for example. So that is something to be mindful of. So that is one of the important things. And to really understand about the learners itself. Then the last point is about promoting positive change. And one of the first quote speaks about that it needs to be, a continuation of the program. And the second quote specifically on the program design to link that to go back to school. And that's both quite important because it needs to be long-term and ideally include some strategies how to implement it in the school. Otherwise, you might risk the idea that people are very enthusiastic to attend the CPD program, but then are unable to really to implement it or cascade it to the colleagues in the school. And this is especially relevant when you speak about changing attitudes and values, beliefs, because it needs to, it is not a once-off process. It needs to be ongoing. And therefore, it's important that that there's some continuation that could be, for example, through professional learning communities that are more things that are more implicit ways of professional development. A chat in the coffee room with your colleagues, for example, these are ways to implement it, for example. Then the concluding remarks. So when we look at the required skills, knowledges, and attitudes and values for development education and global citizenship education, there are a few things that came out that are very important, and that's considering the role of the facilitator as well as the program developers in the way how they design the courses, course materials, and the CPD programs. Are these courses applicable to the diversity of the students and the teachers, or despite the efforts, do they perhaps still use a very Eurocentric approach? Then the increased awarenesses are influenced by the personal and professional experiences of teachers and the context in which they're situated. So yeah, the context is really an important aspect, as well as the increased awareness and what was said before about disrupting the existing values and beliefs as well. And linking that to the role of the facilitators, the facilitators also play a very important role in that. If they facilitate this program, they need to be able to engage in the process of reflection and action. Then the third point, the importance of the pedagogies that are practical to implement and context specific. Very often there's just a standard program, and that is for everyone in different contexts, but it doesn't always work, or it's not always applicable to people that work in all the different contexts. So that is something that program designers, for example, need to be very mindful of. And lastly, yeah, CPD needs to be ongoing, so it's not a once-off initiative and then you know everything, all the strategies. But you also need to have the support from the school leadership that allows you allows spaces and time to internalize and reflect upon your new learnings. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Joyce. That was just such an interesting and really relevant presentation for all of us, I think. Yeah, thank you so much for summing it up so well at the end there. I think these are all issues, everything you're mentioning, from the role of the facilitator to the important focus on reflexivity and on skills and competencies that are appropriate for context in which the learning is taking place. These are all issues that we ourselves are very much considering and grappling with every day. So it's really, really interesting to hear about that within the context of post-conflict South Africa and how it's playing out for teachers there in terms of CPD. So thank you so much for that.